Okay, good afternoon. Welcome back. This is the fourth week of the semester. Just a quick announcement, and then the plan for today is for me to introduce the themes, the narrative tropes in the works of a famous science fiction writer, one of the founders of the genre of science fiction, French writer Jules Verne, who was very popular during his time and into the 20th century. His books were usually global bestsellers. And up until the 1960s, kids in a variety of countries around the world would have read at least one of his books. They were republished, reprinted through the 20th century. They're still in print now, but they were very popular for almost 100 years after his death. He died in 1905. One of the novels, the novel that we'll be reading and discussing, because it has a vehicle, was in fact his last book, the last book he published that was written entirely by him. Because then after his death, since he was so popular and his books were selling so much, during the next 20 years, his son kept publishing books saying, "Oh, I found this manuscript, I found that manuscript," but most probably he just found ideas from his father's archive, ideas for novels that he himself developed and sold profitably under his father's name. I hope there will be time at the end of this class to begin an activity on his readings, trying to compare technologies of the turn of the century between the 19th and the 20th century and technologies of today and the reactions of the people to them. On Thursday, we will complete Bumblebee. We will watch a few more scenes from Bumblebee. If you missed Thursday's class, you can still find, of course, Bumblebee on a variety of platforms. But on Thursday, I will recap the story in the film, the scenes that we watched together on Thursday. So the announcement is quite simple. Just to tell you that I haven't had time to review and grade your assignments, and I also have at this point a bunch of forms from class discussions and in-class activities that I need to review and grade, and I'll get to them. The Concorso was the biggest program at the beginning of the semester for me. It took a lot of my time. It went well on Sunday, beautiful day, incredible turnout. Some of the car owners couldn't come when we rescheduled, but others joined us, and some came the day of. We had a very nice selection of Italian cars, from Lancia to Ferrari, De Tomaso, Alfa Romeo, Fiat, Maserati. Well, between 70 and 80 cars. And luckily, this year too, as in previous years, there was one student who came to give a little bit of help, who volunteered for extra credit, and I'm glad to have offered that opportunity and had people take advantage of it. So, I haven't forgotten about your homework. If you haven't done the homework assignments, just do them even if the deadline is past, because I haven't reviewed them yet. So that would be fine. If you need assistance, especially if you join the class at the end of the ad hoc period and you need assistance with the homework, come to me after the class, write to me, schedule a Zoom meeting with me. This is one of the presentations that you find under week 4, and it's linked there. It's a separate module, and there you will find also the readings, which are excerpts from The Master of the World, a novel published in 1904 by Jules Verne. So the first thing to say, because I said we're reading The Master of the World because there is a vehicle. But actually, there was another novel that was not published until the 1990s, and it was in fact the first manuscript that this French author, born in 1828, sent to a publisher in the 1860s and was rejected. It was rediscovered at the end of the 20th century, published by a scholar. But we should mention the fact that in this novel, which again was published posthumously, Paris in the 20th Century is the title of the English translation. Jules Verne had actually talked about automobile. Imagine we're in the 1860s, 25 years before the first automobile ride by Bertha Benz. So this is really science fiction from the point of view of the writer and the readers. He, the French writer, imagines Paris populated by a fleet of machines with internal combustion engines and or with hydrogen fueled engines. His inspirations is marked clearly because often Jules Verne mixed history and fiction. The Lenoir engine mentioned on the second line, and in the readings you can click on the link, is in fact based on reality. Lenoir was a French-Belgian engineer, and in one of the previous presentations I showed you a picture of a Lenoir engine, one of a number of engineers who in the middle of the 19th century, during the 1850s and early 60s, came up with a project for an engine before the automobile was available. So I've included just a couple of pages from Paris, this novel. You can just give a look to satisfy your curiosity, but again, we have someone who was interested in the technology of the automobile before it became a reality. In general, among other genres, we find in the production of Jules Verne, who was very prolific, a whole slew of novels based on technologies of different kinds. Usually the author was just reimagining existing technology, amplifying some of their qualities or changing their functions. For example, in this, one of his famous novels, he imagines a group of people traveling to the moon and then coming back to Earth. How do they get there? They board this projectile, which in fact is also shaped like a train, right? You see different sections linked with chains to one another, and they have windows. So you see in here a hybrid of different technologies, the train and artillery. And in the novel, they imagine that a giant gun, placed, I believe, in Florida, shoots this projectile in the direction of the moon, and that's how they get there. And then, of course, it seems like they're stranded, but they manage to get back. During the trip, they find they have a saboteur on board, someone who's trying to sabotage their trip. But you get a sense of the nature of the science fiction written by Jules Verne. Another famous example is Captain Nemo in the novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And most of these novels have been rendered into films. Often multiple films have been based on these novels. In here you find this inventor and leader of the crew of this submersible ship that has an electrical engine and is able to travel all around the world. And of course, Nemo is also like the mad scientist will find in The Master of the World, somebody who has ambitions, who wants to conquer the world. In another novel, you find a giant ship as big as a small town. Again, it's not a completely new technology, the same way that submarines were being experimented with in the 19th century. Is that just the size of it and the size of the community of humans on board that makes it interesting and unique. And here we come closer to the narrative that we're about to read, because Master of the World from 1904 is the sequel to a novel where the evil scientist slash engineer Robur has created this flying vessel, which, of course, once again, is a hybrid form of technology. We recognize the shape of this as the shape of this flying vessel as a regular ship. You see cannons on board, you see giant propellers, but this time it's not just a propeller that you would find in the back of the ship immersed into water. There are two propellers, one pulling, one pushing, and a fleet, a large number of small propellers. They're supposed to be 2.5 dozens. They look like more in here, that keep the ship afloat. What you see here are actually legs, paws to plant the ship on the ground. And of course, you have a crew on board. You have cabins on the bridge, below the bridge. So in many ways, this is not such an exotic thing, other than the fact that it is flying. A lot of the books by Jules Verne sold well because of their illustrations. Illustrations were part of the lore for many of these books. In here, you see a luxury edition from the earliest part of the 20th century of the novel that we will be reading, Master of the World. And I want to show you the pictures because it's interesting how they excerpt the book, how they represent the essential elements of both the plot and the themes in the book. In the frontispiece, you find, for example, a reference to a natural landscape. Yes, Isabel?
Was the illustrator for all of Jules Verne's book Georges Roux?
A lot of them. The best illustrator, the most popular, was Roux. But I was looking before, the illustration of the albatross, the flying ship, was not by Roux, but maybe they hired somebody else for the American edition. But a lot of those were by Roux. Yes. So I was saying, frontispiece, interestingly, instead of showing you the technology at the center of the book, shows you a natural landscape. And in fact, this is the representation of a fictional dormant volcano in North Carolina, where at the beginning of the book, we find Robur, the inventor, using the crater, which is inaccessible according to the descriptions in the book, as his base. And of course, he has no trouble reaching the top of that mountain because his vessel can go on a road as well as fly. And therefore, this is what he does to get there. And so that's not only his base, but also the place where he is working on this invention and perfecting the invention. So the only reason why a natural landscape is used to symbolize the contents of the book is the implied suggestion that the invention by Robur that you find at the center of this book is disruptive to the regular flow of things, and to nature in general, that technologies are upsetting the natural balance of society and the natural relation between man and nature, which implies always, according to the moralistic views of Verne, a certain degree of respect. Nature wants to be respected. The very fact that in the 19th century, in this fiction, you have a dormant volcano at the top of which nobody has been able to get, and there are attempts to go there at the beginning of the novel once they start seeing smoke, but the smoke is just a shop. It's just Robur working on his invention. Then they hear sounds, but those sounds is just the sounds of the mechanical wings of the Terror. Terror is the name of the invention. So they attempt to go there by climbing, by using a hot air balloon, and they fail. But the implication is that humans should respect nature because nature is so powerful. And this is appropriate for humans. And instead, technology is pushing humans in the direction of the desire of turning into gods, the desire for complete domination and control of the earth and the universe, which is not necessarily a good thing because humans are not endowed with the necessary moral qualities to have such a position of power within nature and the universe. Let's look at the next page in the book. After you turn the page from the frontispiece, you find an image that summarizes the main elements in the novel. You find once again the mountain I showed you before, but this time it looks like a veritable eruption, the eruption of a volcano, when in fact it's just the people living around the area who believe there is the threat of a volcanic eruption. In reality, the crater has become a factory or a shop to work on this invention. You see smoke coming, another sign that will be interpreted as a sign of impending doom by the people around. But again, this also simply signifies the disruption in their lives. And then out of it, you see the machine flying, and there will be other illustrations where you see it better, but you can see the four wheels bigger in the back. You can see the wings that are just moving. The machine is flapping the wings mechanically. And once again, you see a structure on top that makes it look like a boat. Then you see the same machine going on a road with a lot of smoke, dust following it. And finally, you see this machine during its transition from underneath the sea, in this case it's a lake, and the top of the water. And these are the four modalities, the four kinds of mobilities that are afforded by the technology invented by Robur, which can fly, go on a road like a vehicle, go underwater, go on top of the water. So it's submarine, boat, automobiles, and plane combined. To the side, you see the good protagonist, the protagonist on the side of good, fighting the good fight, who is John Schrock, a federal agent sent to investigate the apparitions of the technology. Initially, they believe there are four machines, and it's only halfway through the book they understand that the same machine is able to travel in four different ways. The commonality is still a form of disruption through the representation of the smoke and flames coming from the volcano as an eruption. So something that is going to threaten the regular lives of the people of North Carolina. Through the representation of excessive speed on the road, signified by the amount of dust, which certainly would interfere with anyone traveling in the road. And in here, you see ships of fishermen and their activities is being disrupted by this submarine that comes up on the water. So overall, the idea is technology is disruptive and threatening to society. And then you see the protagonist on the side of good in a reflective, contemplative attitude, because he will himself be tempted to embrace the activities of the crew of the Terror, join Robur, but through his own reflection, he will understand that this would not be right, and he will then proceed to try and destroy the technology to stop, to prevent any additional disruption. So keep this in mind, because it's a nice illustration that guides you to the understanding of the novel. This is another illustration by Roux of the Terror, and you can see the folded wings, right, which can be used as wings, as flapping wings when the vehicle is in the air. You can see parts that are similar to a submarine, right? In fact, the first structure on top of the nose is reminiscent of the one we saw for Nemo's submarine. You see a giant hatch, so you know that this is not a vehicle, an individual vehicle, but it's a vehicle that is similar in many ways to a ship with an entire crew. You can barely see turbines in here, because the vehicle is capturing electricity from the air and then has engines that transform that energy and provide the energy for the flapping wings. And of course, you see once again John Strock near this vehicle. This is when he will be kidnapped, taken on board, and he'll get to experience the technology. And in here, we are inside the crater of the dormant volcano. Once again, at the very beginning of the first chapter, another illustration that provides an idyllic representation of nature, with a simple carriage, with people being transported, with houses, with woods, with peaceful rivers, and this volcano in the background is just a symbol of the threat that is about to fall on these people. So the insistence is on disruption. This is the result of coming up with technologies that are too advanced. So there is a somewhat, even though Verne is a science fiction writer, there is a somewhat negative representation of advanced technologies. And the idea that nature is powerful is to be feared, and that there should be a harmonious coexistence of humans within a natural environment, and technologies can upset that delicate balance between nature in its raw format and humans that modify the territory, but only partially, with their activities, whether it be agricultural activities or commerce or industry. Here too, you find one of the episodes where the vehicle that is moving at tremendous speed, so much that it becomes almost invisible, surrounded by a cloud of smoke and dust, is disrupting regular traffic, right? You see the horror in the face of the poor man who has been thrown to a ditch with others in a carriage by this vehicle coming by at incredible speeds of about up to 150 miles. And in fact, they have in here one of the lines from the novel, Un chauffeur de l'enfer, which means a driver from hell, right? Here too, you see another version of the image you found at the beginning of regular fishing activities being disrupted by the terror coming to the surface. And interestingly, then one of the illustrations shows you the people from the lower and middle classes reading about this technology in the newspapers. Because the idea is that society must either support or reject a new technology, and the way they come to their decision is by getting informed, which also means that newspapers, the media, have a responsibility and a role that is similar to the role of the governmental leaders, and people can be either manipulated into a frenzy, which is what newspapers do initially. They just want to sell more copies, and therefore they exaggerate the dangers of the phenomena that people have noticed around the volcano. Or the media can be used on the side of good to educate people, to instruct and guide people, telling them what to do when faced with such a situation. Now, going back to the prequel, to the novel before the one that we read, the one with the flying vessel, here we find the frontispiece with the inventor Robur on top at the front of this ship that is sending lights to the ground that scare people. And in here too, in the illustrations of this previous novel from 1886, you find nature in a conspicuous way. For example, instead of showing the flying vessel flying in the skies, they show them in this kind of canyon. The idea still being that technology changes the interaction between humans and nature. Bring humans closer to nature. Because what you need to realize in terms of literary tropes is that during the 19th century, a lot of books, non-fiction and fiction books, centered on the unexplored parts of the planet, on ideas that even in the 19th century, we don't know everything about nature. We don't know anything about the bottom of the oceans. There are places on the planet that are only sparsely populated and are virtually unknown. There are animals we don't know of, which is the kind of tropes that will then generate other books that stories you're familiar with. For example, all the stories about King Kong. And I've included beautiful pictures of models made by a French modelist, a real professional making models for museums, private collections, for other marketing projects. His name is Deschamps, Jean-Marc Deschamps. I don't remember whom he made this for, maybe the Verne Museum in France. But this is a model based on the descriptions found in the book, so as true to the page as possible, where you can see the first invention by the same character who then creates the terror. So this is the first novel, and in it you can appreciate with more details what I showed you before. There is two giant propellers, one pulling in front, one pushing in the back. There is a rudder to steer this. You can see that the general shape of the hull is the same as a regular ship. Same for the various cabins on top, including the place for the helm. And then you have a series of a few dozen propellers that are supposed to keep the ship afloat. And then you see the feet that are supposed to keep the ship planted when it lands. You can also appreciate that they have a harpoon on top, but they also have a true cannon in the middle of the ship from which they can hit targets on the ground. The name of the flying ship is the Albatross. The title of this novel, this first novel, is Robur the Conqueror, and Robur is also the protagonist or the antagonist on the side of evil for the Master of the World, even though you have 28 years between the publication of this novel and the next. You can see another beautiful picture. And of course, they have this black flag with the sun, which gives them a kind of a pirate flair, right? They are like pirates of the sky. This is the model that Deschamps did for the novel we're about to read from, The Master of the World. And this is the vehicle that is able to fly, go on a road, underwater, on top of the water, with the inventor Robur at the helm. But you can see how hybrid technologies come together. For example, you have the same helm that you would find on a boat in there. You find a periscope. In here, you find hatches similar to those of a submarine. You find flapping wings that are very similar to birds' wings, right? And everything is done beautifully. You can see more details in this picture, and then you can appreciate the size when in this picture where the creator of the model, Deschamps, is holding it. And this, in fact, went into the Verne Museum in France. This is, and of course, you can imagine how many months, probably a year or a year and a half, must have gone into the realization of this model. So, in general, all the novels based on a technology, where the technology moves the story in the novel by Jules Verne, are based on this kind of pattern that you will certainly find heavily used in both Robur the Conqueror, the 1886 novel, and then the sequel that we will be reading more pages from, Master of the World. Of course, something to keep in mind that this is commercial fiction and popular fiction, right? It's intended to reach as many readers as possible. So, for example, the first point is something you find constantly in films, because films too are commercial and want to reach out and capture as many viewers as possible. That is to say, the beginnings, the openings of these stories are more complicated than the conclusion. At the beginning of the story, you find so many possible narrative threads, so many elements, but then by the end of the story, in this case a book, but you can think of any number of films suffering from the same issue. By the end, if you think about it, you see that a lot of the threads were just lost, that the conclusion is not really bringing everything together in a coherent, consistent way, in a way consistent with the development of the arc of the story. But the actual pattern I want to direct your attention to follows these stages. At the beginning of the story, we don't find the technology being displayed right away. You have to wait, and there is a building of tension to get to that point. So the first part is usually full of mystery, accompanied by suspicion, because once again, the idea is that the representation of the technology is rather negative. So the theme, the emotion associated with suspicion is simply a way to externalize the intellectual idea that one must be suspicious of new technologies if they're so different from whatever exists in society, if they push the relationship, the interaction between humans and nature, or between humans and humans within the same society, to a breaking point. And certainly the inventor of this technology, like many of the evil guys in 007 movies or other films, wants to change society, wants to revolutionize society through the use of this technology. Following the reveal of the technology, at some point it's clear that there is, in fact, a technology with certain characteristics. Another point that is common to several of these stories, and in particular the stories about Robur, is the abduction. So a character or a group of characters is abducted and kidnapped and taken on board the vehicle, on board the vessel, and therefore their they're left free to experience the technology. They're not treated as prisoners, they're treated as guests, because it would be impossible for them to safely abandon the vehicle. And through the exposure to the technology, spending days or weeks on board one of these vehicles, they go through the next stage, which is seduction or fascination. They're seduced by the inventor, because the inventor himself, even though he is an evil character, is fascinating, charismatic, has a strong character, and they're fascinated with the technology itself, right? Fascination means that they have almost hypnotic relationship with the technology. They forget about their doubts completely. They forget about the arguments they went through before they came aboard the technology, about the dangers, the risks associated with this kind of extreme technology. And it seems like they're about to convert to the use of this technology, embrace and support this new technology, but then, as you saw from John Strock, they reflect on it, they come to their senses, they get back their moral compass, and therefore the next stage in these narratives, which is also something you find in almost every 007 movie and plenty of other movies, you have the distraction of the new technology, the distraction of the risky, dangerous, threatening technology, which is either in itself a moral lesson, right? So the reader understands that this distraction is justified, or the moral lesson can be explicit. That is to say, a character or the narrator will stop and say, it was good. This was a good decision. It's good that this technology was destroyed because humanity wasn't ready. Usually that's the moral lesson. And then the conclusion represents a return to normalcy, right? The characters who were kidnapped, who were first suspicious of the existence of a new technology, then kidnapped and taken on board the technology, then almost converted to it, and then were active participants in the distraction of the technology, are supposed to return to their regular lives. But there is always a question mark, meaning after this kind of adventure, is it possible to believe in regular and normal life? And usually the novels end with an ambiguous ending, meaning that there is always the possibility of a sequel, because of course it's a commercial kind of writing. So the writer wants to see if the novel sells, they'll want to continue with sequels. And so at the end of Robur the Conqueror, it looks like the inventor might have died. And then instead it comes back. But again, the death was not clear. We weren't completely sure that the inventor had died. But in terms of normalcy, there is the sense that because the world was exposed to the possibility of this technology, the world has lost its innocence. They know that this is possible. They know that this kind of technology, which seems so advanced and out of reach once the scientist has died, because this scientist / inventor comes from outside academia, from outside the industrial world, and this is common to a lot of films of the 20th century as well. Even though this technology, once destroyed, cannot be easily reproduced, everyone can think that someone else will be able to invent something similar. That if one human was able to design and build and fly and steer one of these vehicles, then someone else in the future might bring back that technology, and therefore we cannot be as hopeful about the future. The serenity of the world, in a way, is compromised, also because these are global technologies, right? That once they're out, they'll have an impact on the entire planet or the universe. And in here, I have the plot of the first novel. We don't have to know all the details, but just to see the execution of the pattern in the 1886 novel, where Robur comes up with the invention of the flying vessel called the Albatross, the model with the flying ship with the propellers on the bridge. So at the beginning, the premonition, the mysterious phase, is made with humans becoming aware that there is some kind of vessel that is moving at incredible speeds and seems to be able to reach every corner of the world very quickly. The only evidence they have of that is music from above, and it cannot be the Lord, the good Lord. It has to be a technology, right? And noise, other strange noises, which are in fact the propellers, like the whirring sound of the propellers. Then other signs that there is such a technology and a possibility of the threat associated with technology, they find flags on top of monuments that are very tall. So somebody from above, from a flying vehicle, a floating vehicle, must have planted it. Other buildings also. In the next part, we have the kidnapping. Following a debate in Philadelphia, there is a debate in a circle of inventors and scientists. The topic of the heated debate is, what will be the future of flying? Hot air balloons or planes? That is to say, vehicles that are flying, devices that are lighter than air, or devices like modern planes that are heavier than air. Following this debate, the lead experts of these fictional institutes are kidnapped and taken on board the Albatross. And they can experience that technology for about 3 weeks. This is the abduction phase. Of course, they're captivated by the technology and the inventor. This is seduction and fascination. Finally, they escape from the Albatross, and they are responsible for the distraction of the new technology because they think this in the hands of someone as evil as Robur is too dangerous, and they'd rather lose access to the technology, because this is a technology none of them would be able to reproduce even after they were on board, than put humanity in dangers. The moral lesson in this case is quite prolonged, because at the end of the novel, the characters on the good side, the scientists and inventors, get together for the inaugural flight of a dirigible, right? So something that is opposite to the technology of the flying ship made of metal. And the dirigible is called Go Ahead, as a feel-good name. A new version of the Albatross, rebuilt by Robur, appears in the sky. There is a duel. They themselves, at some point, rescue the crew of the dirigible, because the dirigible is an old-fashioned, frail technology. So they are in need of rescue because of the maneuvers they make. And then there is a long speech by the scientist himself, which represents the moral lesson. And here you find it, and of course everything can be found in the class wiki. See how formal this is, right? There is a crowd that gathered for the inaugural flight of the dirigible. It says, "Citizens of the United States, my experiment is finished." Why experiment? Because this is a test. In his view, he came to test humanity and see if humanity was ready for this new technology. But you could ask me, even based on the limited information I provided, isn't Robur the evil guy? He is. And he seems to be bent on the distraction and the reform and the revolution of modern societies. But in the final speech, his voice is also the voice of the narrator, the voice of Verne, who had this negative view of advanced technologies, even though he used them to sell books. And what is his recommendation? My advice to those present is to be premature in nothing, not even in progress. Meaning progress, coming up with new technologies is good, but it cannot be done at the detriment of the human soul, right? You lose your soul, your values, because you embrace a technology that is too advanced for your system of values. That's why I call this a moralistic view. Interesting, right? And he says, oh, nations are divided, this would be turned into a military weapon. So, no, I cannot give you access to this technology. And he concludes, after more sentences, I take my secret with me, meaning I'll disappear. And he says, it will not be lost to humanity, which is kind of a threat, right? Because the idea is that it is also very risky. At the very end, you find a couple of sentences by the narrator. And the narrator says, Robur is the science of the future, meaning, again, the world has lost its innocence. Sooner or later, whether it be Robur or someone else, this technology will come back. Perhaps the science of tomorrow, meaning you don't know when someone will come up with that invention, which is very old-fashioned, very ludicrous, right? Because you have an industrial network, you have a scientific network, you know what's coming, more or less. Things don't appear from one day to the next, although artificial intelligence moved quite faster. 10 years ago, every prediction, including those that I would make in a class on technology and knowledge, were that we were 20, 30 years away from real artificial intelligence, and instead it came within 5 years and then became accessible to the public just a few years after that, right? Okay, so let's go through quickly the plot of The Master of the World. The story is set in the year 1903, and it starts in North Carolina, although the name of the town, the name of the mountain are fictional. And most probably Verne, who had visited the United States, got his ideas of North Carolina from books. And this is the place, this is the area, the Blue Ridge Mountains. When you're in the class wiki, you can click, you'll be taken to Google Maps to see the approximate area where the fictional volcano is set. There are scenes in the Great Lakes, scenes in the Caribbean, in the area of the Caribbean. The hero, meaning the one who saves the day, is John Strock, defined as head inspector in the Federal Police Department. So you can think of him as a quasi-FBI officer, detective. In the plot, in the first part of the plot, you find various apparitions of this machine called the Terror, and they're all disruptive in nature. People think it's 3 or 4 machines, not just one. And at some point, Strock is hit to the head, wakes up, and he's on board this machine that he can explore. It's not kept in a cell, which is also very typical, right? That the good guys are always able to move around and then damage the technology, which is part of the parody in Austin Powers. But I don't know if your generation even knows about Austin Powers, right? But in Austin Powers, there is a scene where the son of Austin Powers says, just shoot the guy, right? Now, don't place it in a room with sharks waiting for them to die, because they'll get free and come back to hunt you. Ignition is a trope popular in literature of the past, from Homer, right, the Odyssey, to the 19th century. The idea that someone who was believed to be lost or dead comes back and is recognized. In this case, they recognize this as Robur, that has survived from the previous novel. Same narrative pattern: mystery, anticipation of the technology, abduction of the hero, seduction and fascination, followed by distraction of the technology, and the conclusion is a partial return to normalcy because it's impossible. And I put Dr. Evil If you don't know Austin Powers, please go find, especially the first and the second of these movies. But this is a parody of a long series of characters, especially those in the 007 movies from the 1960s, 70s, but up to the 2010, of this kind of scientist slash inventor slash leader or new leader of the world who wants to dominate the world with some kind of secret technology that the entire industrial network is unaware of, right? And we don't know where this technology comes from. We don't know where the people working for Dr. Evil or Dr. No in 007 come from, right? They always have an entire crew or hundreds of guards, etc. And we don't know who they are, where they lived, if they have a family, etc., right? But the idea comes from the science fiction books like the ones that we are reading, right? Seclusion is the key word in here. It seems like this kind of character has evolved outside of regular society and come back later. From the point of view of the character, the profile of the character, help me if you have any character in mind from movies from the last 30 years, because all these elements, or many of these elements, can be found in other characters from modern films. Robur is like any other evil scientist. Very temperamental, right? Unpredictable when interacting with others, and therefore threatening. Narcissistic, of course, big ego, but at the same time charismatic. People can be seduced by this kind of evil guy. Displays hubris. Hubris is a Greek concept. In the Greek culture of the classical times, hubris is this ambition to rival with the gods, to go beyond the boundaries set by morality, and morality is connecting to religion, of course, right? So hubris is every time humans pretend to dominate nature instead of living in harmony with nature, dominate the universe, or surpass gods or compete with the gods. There are always some kinds of plans to change the world in one way or the other. The character is opposed to the regular authorities of the world as is set, and anarchy and chaos come with it. Again, you find that in Evil Guy from Spider-Man movies to 007 to, of course, Dr. Evil in Austin Powers. I placed a couple of these illustrations. They're beautiful, from another French illustrator, Robur from 1902. This is there, and so this is 2 years before the novel. Again, in the novel we're reading, you find wings or fins being used to direct or propel these flying vehicles, flying vessels on top of the city of Paris. Fascinating illustrations, and you can find more on the internet. Okay, so the novel is not entirely modern or cutting edge in terms of technology. There is a mix of old and new. So, for example, in the first novel, you've seen how the albatross is shaped like a ship. The Terror has wings like a bird, flapping wings. But on the side of being really innovative, both vessels seem to be virtually ubiquitous, meaning that they can go anywhere very quickly. They can move. So it changes the notion of mobility, right? Traditional mobility is, whether it be on foot, on horse, or with a train, is I move from point A to point B. Instead, this kind of vehicle can be at point A and right almost the next instant be at point B. There is no transition, no in between. Energy is always endless. These vehicles get electricity from the air, from the water. They don't have issues. They don't need to refuel. Both vehicles are pre-modern in some ways. Inside, the decor is not the Enterprise from Star Trek, but it's very much like a ship or a train with old furniture, and the cabin of the leader is like the office of a wealthy person, right? That's why, in some ways, this genre is similar to the steampunk genre, if you're familiar with it, which is a mix of modern cutting edge technologies and older elements, right? This is what I meant before, and you can read these notes. The important part is that if you remove the journey from point A to point B, if going from point A to point B is almost instantaneous, then mobility is all about being on the move rather than moving from one point to the next. Mobility becomes its own place or dimension, right? It's not functional to transferring from one point to another. It's all about being on the move. Also, very common in later literature and films, this idea that in order to manifest the innovative nature of this technology, you need someone who's a virgin technologically. Therefore, someone who can express surprise, who can have an intense reaction to the novelty of this technology, emotions, reactions that are being modeled for the reader, right? In this case, the tech virgin is John Strock. John Strock is an experienced federal officer, but has no knowledge, no experience with these kinds of technologies, and therefore, being a virgin of that, you can understand how he gets taken to the point where he thinks he might join the man he's supposed to arrest for the federal government, okay? And I'll leave the rest to you. It's also important for the protagonist to be not so special, because this way there is a closer proximity between the reader and the character who comes into contact with the technology. This is replicated in other ways. Take Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. Dr. Watson, yes, he's an MD from the British Army, but he seems very average in terms of intelligence and skills in general. And through him, you, as a reader, experience the surprise at the brilliance of Sherlock Holmes, right? So you identify in some ways with the average character of Dr. Watson because Holmes is beyond the ability of a regular human in terms of logic and reasoning, right? And so it's a easy to follow literary pattern. Okay, I don't need to say anything about this. We talked about the moralistic view of society, but keep in mind specifically that in here you have a very conservative view of society. In the novels, like the one that we read, you find a society structure as a pyramid. At the top, you find a small elite of political and intellectual leaders. Intellectuals meaning the writers who will the great writers who will influence people, the great journalists, and the scientists. The professors, of course, the top professors, the star professors. Underneath, in this pyramid of power, in this hierarchy, the next level down is the enforcers like John Strock, because they're supposed to protect the status quo and therefore the order of society. And then the bulk of the pyramid, the thicker level, is the middle class and the upper lower class. That those that are educated enough to read the newspapers, as in the illustrations, right? They can be influenced, but they cannot be told what to do. They need to be educated and in some ways manipulated by the elites. And at the bottom, you find the proletarians, the laborers, the factory workers, the peasants, and those are considered brutes. brainless almost. Their reactions are very animalistic. For example, at the beginning of the book, The Master of the World, people will go into a frenzy one night when they think, because they hear the sounds of this technology, they think the volcano is about to erupt, and there is complete chaos because they themselves don't have the leadership or the control. They need to regulate their emotions. So without proper guidance, they would be lost. And that's why humanity in general was not ready for changes that are too advanced. Okay, so we have time for a group activity.